Thank you everybody for coming. The sign-in link is on the board. And
sure, yeah. And you can short it. I don't need the full bio. I know who I am. Oh, okay. You can do whatever you want.
We're the Federalist Society, conservative, libertarian, and moderate law students.
And moderate. Look at this. That's pretty funny, actually.
Second is the separation of powers essential to our Constitution. And third is the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is and not what it should be. Again, there's a sign-in link, and now I'll turn it over to David to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Trenton. My name is David Phillips. I'm the Vice President for Speakers for the Federalist Society. I'm going to introduce our guest today. And one note on timing, there is a 1 p.m. class in here, so we will have some time for Q&A at the end of Josh's talk, but we'll have to call it at about 12:50. So if everyone can clean up their stuff and file out promptly, that'll be really helpful for the staff. And now for our speaker. Mr. Josh Blackman is an associate professor at the Houston College of Law, specializing in constitutional law, the United States Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. Josh went to Penn State for undergrad and earned a BA magna cum laude in Information Sciences and Technology with a minor in Supply Chain and Information Sciences. He then graduated cum laude from the George Mason University School of Law, now the Scalia School of Law, where he was an articles editor.
No asshole, though.
That's right. He was an articles editor on the George Mason Law Review. Josh clerked for Judge Kim Gibson on the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania, and then for Judge Danny Boggs on the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Josh was selected by Forbes magazine for their 30 under 30 list in law and policy. He has twice testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the constitutionality of executive actions. He's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and also a founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier fantasy Supreme Court.
You should all play. Cash prizes, too.
He's the author of over 3 dozen law review articles,
including
one that's coming out in the November issue of the Harvard Law Review. And his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. And his recent book, Unprecedented, The Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare, was critically acclaimed. And this year, the Cambridge University Press published your more recent work, right? Unravel, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. And we're very grateful to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I am very grateful that the Harvard Federal Society invited me for a debate. A debate, you say, so by myself. This may be a debate I actually win, though, because unlike most things in the debate, immigration, Obamacare, it's really hard. This one is very clear. So I was really looking forward to debating someone from the Harvard Law School community because so many people from this building have taken an issue on this debate, whether the Senate has a duty to vote on the nomination. But as the days drew clear and closer, they couldn't find anyone. I'll chalk it up to a busy schedule. But I won't let that stop me from debating because I know exactly what they're going to say. In fact, they've all said what they're going to say. So this will be a little bit of shadow boxing. As I'll try to articulate what my opponents will say, I will offer the rebuttal. Maybe I'll give a surreply on their behalf. And then I'll open up to questions from all of you. So we are in a very strange place right now. Supreme Court justices have a habit of not retiring in election years. This happens very rarely. There's actually numbers in it that say justices die in the years when their party is in power, so they can be replaced by a president of their own choosing, right? It's very odd to have a situation where Justice Scalia passed away last February in the election year. And immediately after Justice Scalia passed, the Republican line became, we will not hold any vote whatsoever on whoever Barack Obama picks. Doesn't matter who it is. And indeed, after President Obama picked Merrick Garland, a D.C. Circuit judge, Republicans said, we won't even hold a hearing for the guy. We will not schedule a vote. Let the next president decide, okay? So I am not talking about whether it's going to be good politics or bad politics. You can ask me about that perhaps afterwards. My discussion today will be on whether the Constitution imposes a duty on the Senate to take any action with respect to a nomination. The short and long answer is no. But to be fair to my invisible, the Clint Eastwood effect, right? My imaginary debating partners, many law professors, many in this building, in fact, said that there is such a duty. So shortly after the nomination was made, 350 law professors, that's a big number, signed a letter, including from the school Elizabeth Bartolet, Daniel Halperin, Charles Ogletree, and Lawrence Tribe. They signed a statement that says, the preemptive abdication of duty is contrary to the process the framers envisioned in Article 2 and threatens to diminish the integrity of our democratic institutions and the functioning of our constitutional government. The Senate must not defeat the intention of the framers by failing to perform its constitutional duty. Okay? Erwin Chemerinsky, who's a dean at UC Irvine, said, the Constitution creates a duty for the president to appoint justices by using the word shall, There is no clause in the Constitution that says, but not in an election year. The dean of this law school, Martha Minow, and Dean Taha, who is the dean of Pepperdine, wrote a piece in the Boston Globe that says, perhaps some senators are now suspending their own duties simply because Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and Senator Ted Cruz, it doesn't matter anymore, think this will help their race. Okay? President Obama said, quote, I have fulfilled my constitutional duty. Now it's time for the Senate to do theirs. Vice President Biden, the Senate has a constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent. It is written plainly in the Constitution that both presidents and senators swear an oath to uphold and defend. I'll give you one other person who also said the same thing. The Senate has a constitutional obligation to vote up or down on a president's judicial nominees. Do you know who said that? Anyone guess? George W. Bush. How quickly we forget. During the last presidency, when all of you were in diapers, I suppose, there was a practice where Democrat senators blocked the nominations of President Bush's lower court nominees. It happened for years. None of them, Miguel Estrada, Peter Keisler, I can go down the list, never got a hearing or never got a vote. And during the 2000s, there was a significant move among conservatives to say the Senate has a duty to confirm judges. They were wrong then, and they were wrong now. In fact, two of the leading people who argued against this duty were in this building, Professor Sunstein and Professor Tribe. In 2001, those two professors advised Senate Democrats. And they said, as a matter of policy, Senate Democrats should block all Republican nominations. This was in the New York Times in 2001. They said the Senate should change the ground rules. Why? Quote, there is no obligation to confirm someone just because they are scholarly or erudite, Professor Tribe and Professor Sunstein said. Simply because someone is scholarly or erudite, there's no obligation to confirm them. I think the same can be said about Merrick Garland, a quite scholarly and erudite figure. Is there an obligation to confirm him? So there's a lot of chutzpah in here, right? It goes back and forth. Whoever's in power switches their position. My position has been consistent since I've even learned about this issue. This Constitution is utterly silent. So as good Federalists, we start as always with the text of the Constitution. The text matters, which I think is now in Professor Tribe's common law book. It didn't used to be. The Constitution says, the President shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, blah, 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 and judges of the Supreme Court. The President shall nominate. Shall generally means must, although it's actually debatable whether the framers had that same understanding, but I'll go with that for now. The President shall nominate. So President Obama, there's a vacancy, he must nominate. He did his job. Okay, next part. By and with the advice and consent of the Senate. The Senate does not have an obligation to do this, or virtually anything for that matter. In fact, if you go back to Marbury versus Madison, which you probably read your first day of law school, Marshall describes an advice consent as, quote, voluntary. It's a voluntary act which they can choose to exercise or not at all. And then, as you know from Marbury, after the president makes a nomination and the Senate gives its advice and consent, at that point the appointment is complete. But the text imposes absolutely no duty whatsoever on the Senate to act. None. There's no duty to hold a hearing. In fact, the idea of a hearing is something of a later development. The first hearing was not held until 1816. The first time a nominee was asked to testify was in 1925, Harlan Fiske Stone. He was asked to testify the Teapot Dome scandal. There were no questions about his jurisprudence. The first justice who actually testified about his jurisprudence was a former professor here, Felix Frankfurter. A little bit of anti-Semitism in there, but he was also an activist. Okay? It did not become a regular practice to have these hearings until the 1950s or 60s. So the idea of a hearing is even somewhat of a postmodern norm. So let's focus from the text and move on to history, right? Where does this phrase advice and consent come from? Actually, right down the block. This is a phrase from the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 drafted by John Adams. Okay? And it was a common practice under the Massachusetts Constitution that the Senate would say, advice and consent? No, we simply will do nothing and let the nomination wither. We know this because James Madison tried to put a provision in the Constitution that would have required the Senate to affirmatively reject a nomination, right? actually a duty of the Senate, Madison said, to actually reject something. That provision did not make it into the Constitution. So I got the text, right? I got the history, right? So far I'm 2 for 2, okay? Where am I shadow boxing? Okay. They say structure, right? It's embedded within the structure. So Professor Chemerinsky, who's at Irvine, says, the Senate has a constitutional obligation to act because one branch cannot interfere with the functioning of another. Rubbish. Of course they can. Say the president wants to ratify a treaty. If the Senate does not give its ratification, that's it. The treaty's dead. Unless you have this sort of executive agreement that we do nowadays where the ratification process is irrelevant. What if the House wants to pass a bill to raise revenue where it must begin, and the Senate says, no, we don't want to vote on that? The bill's dead. What happens if Congress decides, there are too many federal courts, let's reduce them. Let's strip the jurisdiction of the courts. Let's reduce the number of positions. They keep their salary, but they have no cases. There's nothing unconstitutional about that. In many respects, the Constitution allows one branch to frustrate another branch. We're seeing this big time, usually you could say, in our current political environment. But there's no requirement for them to get along. Madison wrote very clearly, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Okay, so we have text. But what about, what about the argument that the Senate's being AWOL, right? They're not doing their job. The Constitution considers absence. I'll give you a good example. If the House and Senate pass a bill and the president does nothing, it becomes law, right? It becomes law. The Constitution considers what happens if one branch does something and the other one doesn't. It's baked into our structure. Okay? So I got text, right? I got history. I got structure. Let's go back to practice. And this is, I think, where most of the weight is being done, right? Believe it or not, we have 9 justices today. That was not always the case. The first Supreme Court in 1789 had 6 members. Marbury versus Madison, right, had 5 votes. That wouldn't be enough for a quorum today. And Congress, by statute, can specify the number of seats in the Supreme Court. People say, oh, Article 3, the Supreme Court's created by the Constitution, it's different. Not really. The only position named in the Constitution is the Chief Justice. He must exist to preside at the president's impeachment trial. But beyond that, it's totally up to Congress's power to set the number of justices by statute. This is a purely discretionary act. And if the court decides, we want 8, we want 7, we want 6, we want 5, that would be entirely within their province. So it's not even frustrating things because they can set it however they want. Okay? So let's go back in time now, right? At the outset, and this is a point which I'd like to stress many times, we don't have a lot of data here. The reason why we don't have a lot of data is that justices tend not to retire in election years. They realize that this will make a huge show. They either wait right before or after the election or however it works. So it's my conclusion that you can't really draw any pattern of practice one way or the other. You really can't, okay? There have been a number of nominations that were either rejected and resubmitted. You can't really draw too many conclusions, but a few points are worth considering. When Justice Abe Fortas stepped down in 1969, this was on the eve of the election, it'll be a full year before he was replaced by the replacement made by President Nixon. Okay, why? There was scandal. Okay, so a lot of people said they didn't want Fortas to be nominated to be Chief Justice because of some sort of scandal or otherwise. A lot of people said, let's just wait till the next election. Senators actually made this argument earlier. Perhaps the worst of all was President John Tyler. He had one of his nominations stretch almost 800 days. It was vacant. A guy named Reuben Walworth, who you've probably never heard of, but he was actually nominated twice, and the Senate just didn't want to nominate his guy. And the nomination was pending for quite some time. I'll give a few more examples. On the lower courts, now people say, well, the lower courts are different. They're really not. Article 3 doesn't make a difference between a Supreme Court justice and a circuit justice. So a guy named John Roberts, who went here some years ago, he was nominated by President George W. Bush in the final year of his term. Democrats blocked him, right? He was supposed to go to the D.C. Circuit back in 1992. Democrats blocked him. Lillian Bevere, who was a Bush nominee also to the Fourth Circuit. She was the first tenured female professor at UVA. Democrats blocked her also in the final year. They said, let the next president decide. Okay? So I can give you example after example where people said, in election year, we do not let this happen. What about Justice Kennedy, right? This is the example that I'm sure my shadow boxing opponent would certainly raise. Justice Kennedy was confirmed in January of 1988. Huzzah, an election year, right? Not exactly. The seat he was there to fill was that of Justice Powell. Justice Powell resigned in 1987. Why was that seat vacant for so long? Because people in this building opposed the nomination of Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. So he keeps flip-flopping back and forth depending who's in power. Robert Bork was nominated. He had this massive hearing. People called him a segregationist. They said that he'll segregate lunch counters, that he'll force women to back alley abortions. You can go down the litany, right? He was voted down. Okay, then President Reagan took another person from this building, Doug Ginsburg. Turns out Doug Ginsburg smoked some pot with some students. Today that'd be a career enhancement. Back then that was a disqualification. And he never was actually even fully nominated. So then finally they went to the Sacramento moderate, Anthony M. Kennedy, who was confirmed in January of '88 after a lengthy ordeal. But the fact of the matter is, Powell resigned in '87, the year before the election, and had Bork been confirmed, it would have been in 1987. Okay, let's give another example, right? Sherman Minton left the court in an election year, right? He had bad health. What did President Eisenhower do? He made a recess appointment of Bill Brennan, which he said was the biggest damn mistake he'd ever made. He then actually confirmed Brennan after his re-election with a full vote. But again, you do not have a confirmation battle in the election year. The last time you actually had a full Supreme Court vacancy in an election year was with Benjamin Cardozo, who was nominated to fill the seat of Oliver Wendell Holmes, right, the great Boston Brahmin himself. So what did President Hoover do? He actually nominated a Democrat, right? You forget, Hoover was a Republican who nominated a Democrat for the seat. Cardozo was, left of center. He actually worked with the Senate Democrats to put in a liberal because he didn't want to have this fight in the election year. So the past practice simply isn't here. And perhaps the most clear crystallization of this was a statement made by then Senator Biden in 1992 in what became known as the Biden Rule. And Senator Biden gave this fairly lengthy floor speech where he got up there and said, you know what, I heard these rumors that in June of '92 a justice will step down and give George H.W. Bush another seat. And Biden said very clearly he should follow the tradition of Presidents Fillmore and Presidents Johnson and not have a Supreme Court confirmation election year. And the Judiciary Committee should not schedule a confirmation hearing until after the campaign season is over. Biden has since tried to back away from that statement, in my opinion, unconvincingly. He said what he said, and he meant it. And the fact of the matter is, he was opposed to this. I'd like to now pivot to some of the more broader Gestalt issues, if I may. Since the Bork nomination, we've been in something of a downward spiral of Supreme Court nomination and judicial nominations generally, right? This is undeniable. Robert Bork was fully qualified for the Supreme Court. The problem was his views were to the right of Ted Kennedy's, and his views were to the right of Joe Biden's. And on that basis, they Borked him, as the name became. Okay? We can go forward to the Thomas nominations and everything what happened there. So that's actually the 25th anniversary this year. And then the Ginsburg and Breyer nominations were fairly uncontroversial. I think RBG had like 3 or 4 votes against her, even though I don't think she was her liberalism was not much different than Robert Bork's conservatism. They were about the same distance from the polls. But then we go forward to the Roberts and Alito nominations. Back then, there was actually an attempt to filibuster John Roberts, who, by all accounts, was fully qualified, and in hindsight, has been pretty good to the left. With Sam Alito's nomination, there was an effort to actually filibuster him, joined by none other than Senator Obama. He since said he regrets that. In the Senate, with the nominations of President Bush, we actually have, for the first time ever, judicial filibuster of circuit judges, people like Miguel Estrada and Peter Keisler, where Democrats said, we don't want a Guatemalan on the circuit court because he becomes a Supreme Court justice for the right, so they blocked him, top to bottom, shamefully. And as a result, we had this lock where we could not get nominees through. What happened? You had this compromise, right? This gang of 12. You had these 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans who came together and said, okay, we'll let through these judges and let these other judges out, and they were able to get some conservatives onto the courts of appeals. Fast forward to the Obama presidency. Everything happens in reverse, right? Now you have Republican senators blocking Democrat nominees to the courts of appeals. It's the exact same thing in mirror image. But what happened next, though, was the further ratcheting up of this process. Senate Majority Leader Reid announced something called the nuclear option. Okay, what is the nuclear option? Okay, the nuclear option was an approach that says we will eliminate the filibuster for all nominations below SCOTUS. Right? We'll keep it in place for the Supreme Court, at least for now. But for less than the Supreme Court, we will only need a bare majority. And it was through this process that the president got through a number of nominees to the D.C. Circuit. He confirmed 3 at once. And that, as Harry Reid said, was simple math that shifted the balance of the D.C. Circuit. This is guerrilla warfare, right? This is a one-up, one to the next. And the decision by McConnell and Chuck Grassley of Iowa to block nominations for Merrick Garland is simply the next continuation. Okay? So you say, all right, Josh, what's the solution here? What's going to break the stalemate? Okay, so let's just say, as I think will likely happen, Clinton wins in 3 or 4 weeks. I think that's the most likely scenario. And let's say also that the Senate is kept by Republicans, which I think is also probably going to happen. Would anyone be surprised if no votes held at all for Garland? Whoa. So that's what I call the Clint Eastwood effect for real. I've been saying this for years. I think there's a distinct chance that the Republicans say, nominate a conservative to fill Justice Scalia's seat, or we confirm no one. I think that's entirely foreseeable. I think it's entirely foreseeable. And there's absolutely nothing the president can do to the contrary. Now you say, wait a minute, Josh, this is awful, right? How can we do this? Well, take a step back, right? Why is the Supreme Court so damn important? Right? It's what you all study. You know, any issue of the day is decided by the Supreme Court. Gay marriage, right? Abortion, guns, you name it. Elections, right? Any issue is decided by them. So did you think anyone really cares in the long term whether a seat's empty for 2 or 4 years when you get 30 years in the back end? But again, this is the same mutually assured destruction that I think is inevitable. As long as the Supreme Court is the locus of such power, such unaccountable power, it's utterly unsurprising that you'll have this level of focus on keeping the seats in a certain fashion, especially after you have guys like Anthony Kennedy and David Souter and John Paul Stevens, and you name them, who didn't quite live up to their expectations. Okay? I'm going to leave you with a thought experiment. Okay? And I'll turn to my Q&A, which I'll facilitate debate as best as I can. I'll leave you with a thought experiment. Imagine a world, right, where Chief Justice Rehnquist did not pass away in 2003. He died in February of 2008. At the time, Democrats controlled the Senate. And imagine if in 2008, George W. Bush nominated John Roberts to be the Chief Justice in 2008. Same guy, right? And Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader. And at that point, you may recall, it's pretty clear Barack Obama was going to be president. Everyone knew it. And Obama says to Reid, hey, I'm going to appoint Chief Justice Kagan. Whoa, right? I'm going to appoint Chief Justice Kagan, first woman Chief Justice. He tells it to Harry Reid. More clerks for spots for you, 5 instead of 4, right? Do you think for a second Harry Reid would have held a hearing on John Roberts? Or do you think he would have said, let the people decide, let Obama nominate Chief Justice Kagan? For a second, do you think the politics would be any different? Of course not. Of course not, right? But this is why it's political. The framers of the Constitution made the appointment process explicitly political for this exact reason. This year, Chuck Grassley is up for re-election. If the voters of Iowa don't like what he's doing, they can throw the bum out. I think he's ahead in every poll. So there's Democratic accountability here, and by and large, people don't care. Other issues are aside. At the last debate, a question was asked about the Supreme Court. Secretary Clinton even mentioned the Constitution. That wasn't part of her answer. I guess it doesn't really matter who she nominates. That empathy, I guess that's important. But this is political. And so long as a court makes these monumental decisions that affect all of our lives, it will remain political. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to your questions. Scared you all away. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting and absolutely fascinating talk. One thing I'm curious about, is there ever a role for norms to play in constitutional government on your vision? So what I mean by that is this, right? That there's no explicit textual provision, forcing the Supreme Court to sit down, think about, do a really good job of deciding cases. In theory, they could decide cases based on how attractive they think, the opposing counsel are, and, query whether that would be good or bad for the Department of Policy. But I think, like on a purely contextual provision, this is constitutionally fine. On the other hand, I think you can say from creating norms of substantive government, right? This is, pretty disastrous, not least because of the flooding opportunities for hard lawsuits. So the question is this: can we ever construct a meaning of duty, that isn't just a, this meets standards of, minimal textual and political acceptance, but this has some constructive benefit towards creating a larger system that we actually want to live in rather than population wars era that currently exists.
Thank you so much for the question. So I'll answer the first part first. He mentioned, what if the justices rated their cases based on the attractiveness of their advocates? Harry Blackman did that. He would actually rate down how attractive he thought female advocates were in his little papers. You can find this in his library. In fact, when RBG argued, she was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he called her an NYJ, New York Jew. So he has some very interesting ways of rating Roe v. Wade, right? Not the best to women. The second part of your question, I think it's worthwhile, right? What is a norm, right? Governments develop norms, and they've trained to follow them. And one of these norms was the filibuster, right? The idea that if you wanted someone with lifetime tenure, you need more than 50%. Given lifetime tenure, you need someone who gets 60%, which basically means you need someone from the other side to support it. That was nuked. The Republicans could have nuked that norm in 2005 and 6, but they had that Gang of 12 compromise. Harry Reid, to pack the DC Circuit, nuked that norm. And when you start nuking norms, no pun intended, you make other norms less strong. So perhaps there was a norm that we have to give a qualified nominee hearing. We have this sort of downward spiral, norms just start crumbling apart. I don't like the fact that the court has become so politicized. I think it's actually quite awful. But I think this is an inevitable consequence of the nature of decisions it's making. And if you're the average person, not saying Langdale Hall, some of the things they do are quite audacious. And that's why you have these senators focusing on this one institution. So whatever norms may have existed for the confirmation process are either gone or soon will be gone. And I think, predict this, if Republicans keep the seat empty next year, all the norms are gone. I mean, that's it. I think after that, whatever norms we have for the Senate confirmation process are toast. And I don't know what happens to our process after that. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for coming to speak. I wanted to ask is there any mechanism short of a constitutional amendment which could actually decrease the power of the Supreme Court and specifically the unaccountability of it as a sort of pressure release valve? Because I think we would see fewer fights if the court were held more accountable to someone or something.
And I think this is what you're getting at, right? The question is, how can we diminish the impact of the Supreme Court to make it less controversial, less volatile? That may be in the cards. So, I mean, one of the amendments, Governor Abbott, where I live, proposed this Convention of the States. And his argument is we should give either Congress or the states a power to reverse the Supreme Court decision. That if 2/3 of the states vote, they can actually overturn a decision. And you say, wait a minute, Josh, that's a violation of separation of powers. You're giving too much power to the states. I'd reply that perhaps the Supreme Court has aggrandized too much power for itself in the first place. And there might be this restoration of power back. The other flip side, and my friend Eric Siegel at Georgia State makes this argument, maybe the court will say if we have 8 votes for a while, maybe they'll give us a slice of humble pie, right? Maybe they won't try and do so much crazy stuff, given they have this sort of really rocky nature. John Roberts has always been breaking my heart, but maybe he'll continue to break your hearts as well, on the left, I suppose, and on the right. Yes, sir, in the back?
Must the advice and consent of the Senate be explicit?
Give me a little bit more. I think I know what you're asking, but elaborate a little bit, please.
Well, what do you think I'm asking?
No, that's not how it works. I'm asking you, right? Yeah, I'm up here, you're there, right? Maybe tell Harvard. Right, give me a little bit more than one sentence.
So the examples that you provided invariably regard instances where the Senate either actively gave its support or actively gave its disapproval.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
In the times that the Senate has not actively given support, have basically remained silent, why must that be considered absent of consent? Why must the consent be explicit?
Thank you for your question. So I'll read a statement from Senator Byrd. He was a West Virginia senator from 2005. It says, the Senate can refuse to confirm a nominee simply by saying nothing and doing nothing. Okay? Under the Senate's rules at the end of a term, right, so in January 2017, Garland's nomination expires automatically. So it's baked into the Senate's rules that if no action is taken, it's as good as a downward vote, right? If no action is taken, the nominee's toast. So to your question, no action needs to be taken. And this was actually consistent with historical practice of the Massachusetts legislature. The governor made an appointment, and their advice consent is, we're doing nothing. And they just let it wither away. So there's no affirmative duty to do anything in this regard. Yeah?
Is that based on practice, or is there some sort of statutory or constitutional foundation that can be based on?
Oh, I told you, the Senate's rules say if a nomination is not acted upon before the end of the term, right, before January of 2017, it's expired and it's canceled. So the Senate baked that into the rules. The presumption is if no action is taken, it goes away. So I mean, in theory at least, President Clinton would have to renominate Garland, right? You can't just hang on to Obama's nomination. There's a formal nomination process with paperwork and a letter you have to mail. That would have to be done again. So by doing nothing, the Senate's rejecting Garland's nomination. Not all at once, but by the end of the term. I'll pause here to discuss, there's a brief chance of something really crazy happening. I call this a thermonuclear option, right? So as you know, the Senate comes in, was it January 3rd, right? The new Senate comes in January 3rd. The president's inaugurated was at January 20th. So there's like a 17-day gap between the new Senate and the president. So imagine the crazy scenario where the Democrats win the Senate and Donald Trump wins the White House. You have a 17-day period where Barack Obama is still president. In theory, he could renominate Merrick Garland, and then Majority Leader Schumer could rush him through in 17 days. Totally happens, right? So you're talking about norms, right? Norms are out the window. And I think before an 8-year Trump presidency, they would absolutely do that. You think I'm joking, right? I call this a thermonuclear option, right? They would have to get rid of committees, and they have to get rid of the nomination process. But in the Senate, the majority leader has a lot of power. You can say, all right, we're voting on Merrick Garland next week. Go. Got a justice confirmed. But at that point, that would destroy every conceivable norm. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
This might be easy speculation, but ask for speculation. Would you say that the decision of the Senate to not take hearing and to not vote, rather than taking hearing and down voting, is just purely political part of the Senate?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, so here's what's going to happen, right? Garland's a likable guy, right? That's why Obama nominated him. He's a likable guy. He gets up there. I mean, did you see his Rose Garden speech? I was actually tearing up. It was a very, I was tearing up. It was very powerful, very, very emotional. He gets up there and says, oh, I'll vote for this guy. Give him a hearing. He looks like a nice guy. You have these moderate Democrats from, moderate Republicans from New Hampshire and other states, right? I said too much. They'll say, okay, we'll give this guy a vote. You get to 50. So the strategy was, don't give him a vote. Don't humanize him. Don't even give him a meeting, right? Don't actually meet with the guy in public, right? Meet with him behind closed doors. Only Instagram can see it. Chuck Grassley Instagram picture of him and Garland eating breakfast, whatever, right? I think they talk about baseball. The decision not to have it was to keep the moderate Republicans in check, that they can't have an opportunity to vote and get them to a 50. Because you could have imagined, right? There are 46, 47 Democrats. If they flip a couple Republicans out, it might be enough. But again, the filibuster is still in effect. So you've actually Republicans filibustering their own party, which would make no sense. So this decision was made. It was purely political. Perhaps President Obama thought that this politics was about Republicans. It hasn't. We've had, I shouldn't say we, they've had other things occupying them extremely separate from the Supreme Court in the last, 8 months or so. Questions? Yeah, in the back.
You've offered a few hypotheticals. Just personally, what do you expect is going to happen in the next 6 months with the Supreme Court?
Are you assuming a Clinton a victory in Republican Senate? Is that the premise, or?
Your call.
Okay, so I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know. Who the hell knows, right? But let's say there's a Republican Senate and a Democratic president, and let's say Clinton actually renominates Garland, which I don't think is necessarily going to happen. I think there's a decent chance Republicans say, you know what, we're not bringing him for a vote, or we're going to vote him down. because he is bad on the Second Amendment, or he's bad on administrative law, or he's bad on this or bad on that. I can see that happening. I think after, let me put it this way, Trump has made the issue that you have to vote for me because of the Supreme Court. And if Republicans come around and then vote for Garland, I don't think he gets north of 50. Or I don't think he comes for a vote in either event. Now, the more interesting question is if Hillary Clinton decides not to renominate Garland, maybe she'll nominate Nina Pillard or Goodwin Liu or you name them, right? At that point, she may have to say, if the Senate's Republican, they're not going to give it, but if the Senate's Democrat, right? Hillary Clinton president, Democrat Senate, at that point, I think she goes for the fences and she puts in someone that will really galvanize her base. Garland doesn't get people excited. Then they nuke the filibuster altogether. As it stands now, you still have a filibuster for the Supreme Court. That's toast. So if Hillary Clinton can put Goodwin Liu or Nina Pillard or someone on the Supreme Court, who is, I think 15 years younger than the Merrick Garland, I think she would probably do that. If you notice, during the debates and during the DNC, Hillary Clinton's been very circumspect not to say the name Garland. I don't think she's said it in a long time. So there's that. The other possibility, we have other things to worry about, but with Mr. Trump, right? What if he wins the election? Is that a microaggression? Have I offended any Harvard policies? I'll survive. In the event that Trump wins, the big question is, will he actually stick with his list? And he put out this list of, I think, 9 judges and another 10 judges. There's nearly 20 people on this list. I mean, these are all card-carrying Federal Society members. They all have a solid reputation, but who the hell knows what he would do? He's something of a loose cannon. Maybe he'll nominate Chris Christie to get out of the Bridgegate scandal. I don't know. Maybe he'll find someone else who will be like his aide fortis, like his crony in the Supreme Court. So I'm not confident he does anything. The one answer we'll give, and speculation is always awful, is that this nomination will transform the norms, right? This will radically alter the way we look at SCOTUS nominations. It's no longer a given that if you nominate someone in the mainstream, he'll get confirmed. Maybe the error with Bork was that they were too optimistic, right? Scalia was nominated first, Bork came second. If they had flipped it, right? If they had nominated Bork when the Republicans controlled the Senate and Scalia second, both of them would have on the court. But they waited otherwise. So each instance, we learn more things, okay? I will note, though, on one plug, Randy Barnett, who teaches at Georgetown, and we have a new article called Restoring the Lost Confirmation in the Chicago Law Review Online. And we argue that one way that perhaps conservatives can maybe hijack these hearings is by focusing on originalism. What do we mean by that? You've all seen this, right? Whenever a justice gets up and they ask, what do you think about this case? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. You come before me. What do you think about this case? I can't answer that question. These things are shams, right? Nothing good comes from them. Okay, so how do you get around that? Instead of asking them, what do you think about Heller? Ask them, describe the original understanding of the Second Amendment. Discuss the original understanding of the Commerce Clause. They say, well, McCulloch. No, not McCulloch. Talk about, the framers. Sort of Blackstone, right? Go to the original sources. And by forcing nominees to actually talk about these sorts of things, you put them in a different playing field. They can't duck the question. They may seem ignorant, perhaps, but they can't duck the question. And it only takes maybe 1 or 2 senators, maybe Senator Cruz or Senator Lee, pushing these sorts of originalist questions on the process. And I think if that was done, it would radically transform the way people think about originalism. And this is especially important with Justice Scalia's passing, right? We don't have the same patron saint of originalism running around, speaking at law school campuses. So this is our way of keeping originalism alive. Speculation, indeed. Other questions?
Do you think it would be constitutional for the Senate to lift its rules and say that no vote at all means yes?
Ooh, that's interesting. So could the Senate by its rule say that if no action is taken in X number of days, that by itself is advice and consent? Absolutely. The Senate, by its Article 1 powers, its Article 1, Section 5 says, quote, each house shall determine the rules of its proceedings. And if the Senate says, if no vote's taken, that is our consent, then that will be perfectly legitimate. Or if no vote is held within 30 days of the nomination, that'd be perfectly legitimate. I don't think that would work for passing a bill. For passing a bill, I think you still need to record the votes in the journal. There's a specific process. But advice and consent could, I think, be done tacitly. Because, of course, one senator raises a voice vote, and that just kills it, right? If one senator says, I'd like a vote, then you have to actually roll call it. Okay, other questions? Other questions? How was the shadow boxing? I'll mention one last point that some professors have raised. And they said, well, the Supreme Court's special, right? There's something special about the Supreme Court, and you can't compare this to lower courts. And constitutionally, that simply is non sequitur, right? The Constitution doesn't distinguish between higher court judges and lower court judges. It's all from congressional creation. And at bottom, this is a purely discretionary act of Congress. Whether they confirm or not, it's their duty. I don't think we'll be getting a nominee, perhaps, anytime soon. Thank you all so much for your attention. I welcome it. And please, any other questions you can ask me afterwards. Thank you.